Gender identity is now a top issue in women's sports, according to the Wall Street Journal. The editorial board says the issue of athletes who are born male but identify as female has rocked the sports world and the political sphere. They write, every election has issues that are predictable, abortion, the economy this year, but also some that surprise the political class. This year, one sleeper issue is progressive transgender coercion, which is playing against Democrats in races across the country. The board goes on to explain that, quote, these days, the hard edge of the transgender movement has dictated that its view of gender must be imposed nationwide. Senate Democrats have towed that line. As examples of how important the issue has become, the board cites an ad in Ohio that calls out Senator Sherrod Brown for voting to, quote, let transgender biological men participate in women's sports, and criticizes him for being too liberal for Ohio. Media fact-checkers like PolitiFact, however, argue that Brown did not directly vote for that. Transgender sports is not just an issue in Ohio, it's also bubbling up in Wisconsin, where an ad says that Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin, quote, voted to let biological men into women's sports. Her Republican challenger, Eric Hovda, gets applauded whenever he raises the issue at campaign events, per the Journal. The same is also happening in the Montana Senate race. The piece also points out, last year, 69% of Americans told Gallup that transgender athletes should only be allowed to compete on sports teams that conform with their birth gender. The editorial board blames the media for part of the problem, writing, quote, this media conformity is one reason the transgender sports issue is catching Democrats by surprise. The press portrays any dissent on the issue as out of political bounds and gives it no coverage or dismisses as benighted bias what millions of Americans view as common sense. This means voters may hear about it only when politicians make it a campaign issue, and it might cost Democrats control of Congress this year.
So Republicans have been campaigning on this for a long time. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, as I'm sure you are, when they really brought this up in political context the first time with bathrooms, right? It's over, 10 years ago at this point. I really think that the GOP and the right wing and the Steve Bannons of the world have strategically for years wanted to make this a dividing issue because they knew they were losing some women. And now with these ads, which are airing during NFL games and women's athletic games and these billboards, as you mentioned, these are all in key states where they're losing with conservative women over abortion and democracy, I'll say too. I mean, there are a lot of folks who I think are never Trumpers who don't know whether or not they're going to vote for Kamala Harris, and now the women are starting to move over. They're trying to keep them in on the conservative female voter. This isn't about progressives. This isn't even about Democrats. It's about fear tactics, and they're targeting folks in the final stretch. It's a gamble, but it could work because it might just come down to a few votes.
I mean, it could work because most Americans, set aside, the bathroom thing is a different thing. I probably agree with you that was like a little bit of a fear-monger, like public restrooms are not sacred, comfortable spaces, right? Who cares if it's, I think they should be restructured to afford everyone more privacy, like the group, hand washing area and then private for whatever, that's a better way to me. And in general, I'm for just providing additional accommodations for trans people to have their own,
that should be your radar
spaces.
This week. I think this is great. I'm loving what you're saying.
Well,
here.
You're loving me so far, but here's where I'm going to lose you because the sports issue is a little bit different. I do think both at the level of less serious competition in younger people sports and then also elite competition, the advantages under some circumstances that trans women have over other women are serious and should be considered, that is a basic kind of unfairness, and that also making accommodations if it's just throwing people who have recently changed their gender identity in the same locker room facilities at like the high school level is going to cause issues. Like I think it should not be considered transphobic to say that, okay, there are some maybe different accommodations we're going to make there, some basic unfairness that will come into play. That's the view of the vast majority of Americans. It's not been the view of the Democratic-run education departments, but it is an issue.
If you poll Americans, there are all shades of this issue. Just like when you poll Americans on, being pro-choice, there's shades of where people stand on these issues. And I do think that we should have a larger, more healthy conversation around this, because Democrats also need to understand what people are feeling on the ground. Young people are overwhelmingly supportive of the trans community, and the elementary issue, I don't think most young people are concerned about it at schools. But with that being said, we saw this play out over the summer, right? We watched the Olympics and we saw how the right wing spread disinformation, falsehoods about two athletes, and in claiming that they were trans, and of course they were not, and then they faced violence. Trans or not, by the way, when there is a centerpiece, when you make a person who's in the trans community the enemy, there are a lot of people who get really angry at this, and it's because the conservatives have been making this a divisive issue for the last decade and a half. I mean, really forever, but decade and a half. It has become a pillar in the conservative movement, and as a result, you've seen more trans hate crimes rise. In the trans community, at least in New York, there's a housing issue, there's a mental health issue.
Hate crimes against trans people are not increasing. That's
yes,
disinformation.
There are.
No, you want to start throwing. I would not use that term ever, but since you like to use it, that's not. And trans people are subject to violence not because of hate-related reasons, because they're disproportionately more likely to be engaged in work that is criminal and occasionally engages in violence, including prostitution and drug stuff. That is why there is more violence in that community. It's not because they're being hate crime because they're trans. It's just false. It's absolutely false.
I'm saying hate crime due to the rhetoric. That's separate from the work.
That's not happening.
I mean, there is an unhoused situation in New York, and yes, it does often have to do
again,
with
unhoused because
sex work. No, it does. You're right.
Transgender overlaps with mental health issues, and drug addiction issues, which lends itself toward homelessness.
But society does not, because we don't have inclusive laws, because there's workplace issues for transgendered people who cannot access normal work, because we have a prejudiced society, partly due, almost solely due, to the fact that we have a right wing which will point fingers at people. I mean, if you're a trans person on Twitter or any social media, the amount of hate you get, which turns into real life violence.
No.
I just disagree with you, Robby. I think you're coming from a privileged position as, no offense, but as there is a different experience for a white man on X than there is for a woman, a transgender person, a person of color. You don't see the incoming hate.
Say something the trans activist community, not transgender people at all, the activists on this issue, say something that they disagree with on social media, you will be flooded with a level of hate and threats like you will never believe.
That's not good.
This has happened to transgender people. This has happened to Brianna Wu, who I've interviewed on this show, who is I know Brianna. Is a transgender woman. She's an interesting, thoughtful person. We have some disagreements. We've had a civil debate on this show and on social media about them. She's been subjected to hate by activists on this issue.
But that was not about that. It was about her stance on Israel and how she's progressive. But in 2 years ago, transgender violence, hate crimes were at a record high. This is absolutely in correlation with how, number one, the media handles this issue, number two, how conservatives just insert it in every single conversation and make it a divisive issue. Most voters are not voting on this issue. We know what most voters are voting on. And if they're going to try to sway a few conservative women to stay home instead of voting for Donald Trump with these attack ads, that's their strategy. To make them feel like Kamala Harris is not for them. I don't really think it's going to work at the end of the day, but this is all about ginning up the base and the hate, just like they talk about immigrants, just like they talk about crime, just like they talk about the left.
You can criticize their rhetoric all you want. I've criticized some of it too. We should maybe at a later date drill down on the statistics a little bit more deeply. The idea that hate crimes are widely rising is not well founded in data. There are actually very few hate crimes overall. It's a small category of overall crime. Usually people don't commit violence against other people because they hate them or they have some ideological against some aspect of them. They usually commit crime because it's domestic abuse or workplace abuse or mental illness
That's not classified as a hate crime. You can't lump all crime
that
together.
Is what I'm saying is that is 99% of crime is
a small portion of society. So in that disproportionately, there's more hate crime and it's rising for a small portion of America. We'll debate it another day.
All right. More rising coming up.